This is my favorite part of the knife making process. Once everything is all fit together, I've done all the mechanics of it, and now I can really just fine tune everything and make it look exactly the way I want it to. My first step in embellishing these daggers is going to be to carve the flat surfaces of the guards into a much more interesting and elegant shape, with thin borders along the edges and a convex surface in between. After outlining the borders with my engraver, I use a carbide burr in my Fordham tool to rough out the shape that I'm looking for. Once I've removed the bulk of the material, then I can switch to files, which allow me to get much closer to the final shape. Once I finish shaping the guard for the boot dagger, then I move to the guard for the bigger dagger and do the same process again. The faces of this bigger guard are slightly concave, making them much more challenging to file. I use a scraper, which is a modified square file, ground off with sharp corners, so it only cuts on the front end. Scraper works well for this task, but it also leaves a coarse surface that needs to be refined by further filing with a fine file. I also file a little decorative notch at each end of the guard. There's one side done. As with any tool, the only sharp edge should be the cutting edge, so I gently round all of the corners that can come in contact with your hand. Alrighty, these guards are all sculpted, pretty much their final shape, and now I'm getting ready to shape the handles. So the hilts of these daggers are going to be mahogany underneath a black iron wire. I'm going to use this wire and twist it and wrap it around the wood. I'm choosing mahogany not because it's fancy, but because it's very stable, so it won't shrink and expand very much. It should be a really good, long-lasting material to use underneath the wire. I cut these blocks just a little bit big. Better to have too much material than too little. And I'm going to just kind of center the tang in the block and trace it. I'm just going to make a hole right where that is. Find the middle there, connect those with a ruler. Now I know where to drill my hole.
Once the grip core has been burned onto the tang and firmly fitted, then it's time to shape it on the grinder. The core needs to be slightly undersized compared to the final handle dimensions in order to leave room for both the wire and the sterling silver fittings that will be at each end of the grip. And now it's time to twist the wire for the grips. The wire that I'm using is low carbon steel, around 14,000ths of an inch in diameter, or 27 to 28 gauge. To make sure I have plenty of length, I'm stretching it back and forth across the width of my shop to give me 2 strands that I can twist together with a hand drill. Even with an electric drill, it took me several minutes to get the wire sufficiently twisted. To start the handle wrap, I drill a small hole in the narrow end of the grip to secure the end of the wire. A little piece of toothpick wedges the wire in place, and a little superglue ensures that it doesn't work its way out. Once the end is secured, I can begin to wrap the wire around the core, one course at a time, making sure that each course is tightly against the next one. Once the entire handle has been wrapped, then I'll secure the other end of the wire in the same way as the first, with a small hole and a little toothpick wedging the wire in place.
So I learned a few things on the first go around, and so for the second dagger handle I'm doing it a little bit differently. I realized that I needed more wire. I used almost all of the wire that I had from the first spool. So I made a new spool of wire and made it quite a bit longer. And instead of coiling it, I decided to just leave it strung out across the shop. Now I'm working my way from one side of the shop to the other, very, very slowly, reeling in the wire onto the handle as I go. Okay, well, I finished wrapping these grips with wire, and I'm absolutely thrilled with how they turned out. It's a nice tight wrap, and they're dark but shiny and have an amazing texture. It really gives you a good grip on the handle, so I'm thrilled. Last step, well, not really the last step, but the next step is going to be to make little silver collars that go on either end. This will secure the wire, keep it from unraveling should the end come loose for some reason. I don't think it would, but it's also going to make a really nice visual transition from the guard to the grip and the grip to the pommel. The other thing that the spacers will do is they'll be sterling silver, which will be nice shiny material that will kind of pop in contrast to the guard and pommel, which I'm going to darken. So it'll really look quite dapper, I think, when we get it all tied up.
Before I start cutting silver to shape, I make a small cardboard template for each of the ferrules to make sure that I'm using exactly enough material to wrap tightly around the grip. Then I trace that cardboard template onto the sheet silver and cut it out with a jeweler's saw. I'm using 18 gauge sheet for these ferrules, which is thick enough that I'll be able to sculpt them once they're fitted to the grip. A tight-fitting joint is imperative for a clean solder seam, so I use a thin, flat file to dress both sides of the silver ring at once. And then it's time to solder the ferrule. I use a liquid flux to keep any oxidation away from the surface. And then I use a hard jeweler's solder, which should leave a strong and almost invisible solder joint once the piece is finished. Here I'm transferring that little piece of solder onto the end of my titanium solder pick so that I can place it exactly where I want. Once the metal is hot enough, the solder will flow smoothly into the joint. After cooling off the ferrule, then I file off any extra solder on the joint, leaving it smooth and clean. I forged and ground this steel mandrel specifically for this project so that I could hammer the silver ferrules exactly to the right shape and size. Once all the ferrules fit tightly onto the grips, then it's time to shape them. A thermoplastic resin helps to hold the ferrule tightly in place without deforming the thin metal while I file it. I'm a firm believer that the small details make a big difference in terms of the final piece, so a little bit of extra sculpting on these ferrules helps to make the whole piece much more dynamic and visually interesting. And just like that, all the pieces are in place and shaped, and it's time to sand them all and apply the final finishes. I'm not going for a very highly polished look on these particular daggers, but I do want a nice uniform finish that will show off the contours of the sculpting on the guards and pommels. Polishing stones lubricated with mineral oil allow me to get into the tight corners where sandpaper would be difficult to use. Oh, and one last detail. I want to engrave a little star on the round face of each pommel. And then it's time to hand sand the blade. As you probably recall from the first video, these blades are Damascus steel, which means that I'll be able to etch them in acid to reveal an intricate pattern, resulting from the many layers in the blade. In order to get an even etch on the blade, it's important that the blade is completely clean and free of fingerprints or dirt or any sort of oil. Yikes, don't drop it. I like to check the blade to make sure that it's etching evenly, and then I'll put it back in for a good long time to let it etch nice and deeply. And by that I mean I take it out every 20 to 30 minutes to check it and see how the etch is going and clean it off with some fine sandpaper. And once the etch is deep enough, then I'll neutralize it, dry it off, and oil it.
So now basically the last step before I assemble the whole thing is to blacken the fittings, and I'm going to do that with fire. I'm going to use a torch, and I'm going to heat the fittings just to raise the oxides so that they kind of turn black, and then as they cool down I'll dip them in wax, and the wax will make a really durable black coating on the metal. At last I have all of the pieces for the daggers, all with their final finish ready to assemble. Now, these particular daggers I'm going to assemble by hammering. I'm going to peen the tang over. So basically, early on in the process, I soldered on a piece of soft steel to the end of the tang. And the idea is that that goes all the way through the handle, and then I'll hammer the end and mushroom it over, which makes it a really tight fit. These daggers, really start to finish, are very historically inspired. The whole technique of fitting the guard and peening it all together, and the way that the handle is assembled with ferrules that secure the ends of the twisted wire, those are all very traditional, kind of medieval Renaissance European style dagger construction. And you know, I'm pretty pleased with the way it all came out. You don't see a lot of daggers being made this way these days. I'm going to use a little bit of epoxy just to kind of seal the inside and to make sure that all of the components stay, you know, without any little wiggle or whatnot. But the epoxy is not doing the main holding together. The mechanical connection of the rivet at the end of the tang is really the thing that's going to hold this whole dagger together.
Notice I haven't put any glue on the end of the tang here, which is really important because any epoxy would interfere with the peening of the tang. Hammering the end of the tang makes it swell to fill the countersunk hole in the peen block. It's important to have the blade solidly clamped in a large vise for this process. Even though this process is called peening, I actually prefer to use the hammer face rather than its peen because I think it gives me more control. Because I made the peen block and the tang extension from the same steel, once I file off the excess portion of the tang, it will all look like one solid piece of metal. And because every detail is important, I filed the peen block into a decorative finial to finish out the dagger.
Well, I did it. I peened these both together. They're really completely functional daggers at this point, and boy, do they feel good in the hand. I love the balance, especially on this one. You know, it just balances right on that guard, and it just feels so nice. Yeah, these are really just beautiful little pieces. And this little one came out just gorgeous. I love the big one from the beginning because of this really interesting blade shape where it's kind of it gets narrower, and then it has a little bit of a waist, and the fuller that goes only part of the way up. I really liked the blade shape from the beginning. I wasn't as sure about this little one, but boy, it might even be my favorite of the two. Hard to pick. They really go together.